Hey, thanks for making it to Veterans Info Tap. I'm glad you made it. I saw a couple different headlines on this specific topic, and I did find one that I wanted to share with you, and I'll try to get through it here for us. This is on Military Times, and it is really it's an op-ed by a gentleman named Keith Kiefer, a veteran, and I wanted to share it because it really is an important topic. And I'm going to tell you this. Not everything I talk about is going to affect you specifically, but it's going to affect one of our brothers and sisters. And together, if we link arms, we can make it through it, right? Remember that all the benefits that we have and we enjoy today were on the back of other veterans that helped pave the way. We need to continue paving the way together, because if we don't take care of each other, something went wrong. And that's what it's all about. So with that, please hit the thumbs up, subscribe, share with a friend, all that good stuff. I truly appreciate it. Everyone who does that helps the channel push this information to more and more folks. So this again is an opinion piece on Military Times. The official headline here is "Time is running out to recognize, compensate aging atomic veterans," which I agree. Absolutely. This is, it's kind of been one of those sad situations that's just never really been handled appropriately, in my opinion, with regard to VA benefits. So, in 1978, from my station at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, I received an order to deploy to the Marshall Islands to assist with a radiation cleanup project. I was assured, as part of this deployment, I would not receive any more radiation than I would from walking the streets of New York City. That does sound like something that would be said, right? What are you talking about? It'd be the same as if you walk down any city in America. It's, don't worry about it. I worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week, digging up contaminated soil and drinking heavily contaminated water. Since returning, I've experienced a myriad of health problems, including becoming sterile, autoimmune diseases, degenerative bone diseases, and spinal stenosis. By the age of 40, I was told I had the bone structure of a 90-year-old. Wonderful. I am far from the only victim. The Department of Veterans Affairs is overwhelmingly failing to care for those who served in nuclear-related operations, from the U.S. nuclear testing to environmental cleanup. I agree. And now Congress is racing the clock to expand the Radiation Exposure Contamination Act, RECA. Write that down. Call your congressional member. Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. So RECA. Before it expires June 10th. June 10th is the expiration date. June 10th of 2024. So make sure you contact. Look, again, it doesn't affect me, but I'll be making a phone call. So as the custodian of our national defense, Congress has a responsibility to care for Americans, veterans, and civilians alike who risked life and limb to protect our fellow countrymen. As the national commander of the National Association of Atomic Veterans, I work with veterans whose lives were forever changed by exposure to radiation and other toxins. One thing that has remained stagnant since I began this advocacy 18 years ago is that the path to financial help is staggeringly difficult. Many veterans petitioned the VA for over a decade before receiving compensation. Even then, success is far from certain. From August 2022 to August 2023, the VA reportedly rejected 86% of radiation-related claims. Radiation exposure is a triple whammy. The effects of radiation can take decades to appear, leaving aging veterans too sick to work, all while medical expenses are rising. Financial compensation through RECA, remember, that is the act, which is the now I already forgot what it's called. Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. Okay, very very important, which comes in one lump sum. It's often the difference between a veteran and their family going bankrupt or becoming homeless and financial stability. The VA's failure to provide timely benefits makes the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act a critical lifeline for many veterans. Created in 1990 to provide compensation to those sickened by U.S. nuclear tests and administered through the Department of Justice, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act includes benefits for on-site participants, in quotations, of U.S. nuclear testing sites, some populations who lived downwind of test sites, and select uranium workers. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act has helped atomic veterans like Mike Cobb from California. Cobb witnessed 21 nuclear tests at the Pacific Proving Grounds as part of Operation Dominic. He was one of the few men in his unit equipped with protective gear, and even then, it was inadequate. Just goggles. It's not funny, but here's your protective gear. Goggles. Here, I remember, look, I'm nowhere near that type of exposure. But when I was mortars in the Marine Corps, if we had earplugs, we got to use one because we had to listen for the commands up and down the gun line. And we were told, how many earplugs you got? Hold them up, right? And you'd hold up one, and then you'd put your finger up for the other one because you put your earplug in your finger. That was your two earplugs, right? Or they'd tell you to put cigarette butts, which, that works really good. So anyway, moving on. 60 years later, Cobb was diagnosed with bladder cancer, an illness associated with radiation exposure, and successfully received compensation through the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act is an efficient option for atomic veterans who need help now. The last above-ground nuclear tests in the United States were in 1962, meaning the youngest on-site participants are nearing their 80s. They do not have decades to wait for the VA to approve their claim. But a veteran applying for the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act can have help in hand in just 6 to 12 months. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act includes fewer benefits than the VA, but is much simpler to navigate and has been a godsend to many veterans. I had no clue. Now, granted, I would never search for this myself. And even as a county veteran service officer in my professional life, I didn't know about this. So this is important information. As of May 1st, $2.6 billion has reached over 41,000 claimants through the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act program. To put this number into perspective, the U.S. plans to spend approximately $50 billion per year to maintain its nuclear forces over the next decade, almost 20 times the historical cost of the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. But this act is in jeopardy. If it is allowed to expire in June, atomic veterans will be left without a meaningful path to timely compensation. For decades, Congress has ignored the many communities that have been excluded from the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, like the downwinders of the Trinity tests, the first ever nuclear weapon test in New Mexico. On March 7th, the Senate voted 69 to 30 to reauthorize the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act and finally include some of these communities that were left out. The bill isn't perfect. For one, it doesn't include cleanup veterans like myself who were sent in after the nuclear tests, but it is critically important for atomic veterans that the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act be expanded and not be allowed to expire. So we have two things here. Don't let it expire and bolster it up. Contact your congressional elected officials both on the House and Senate side and let them know. I often hear from struggling veterans that they fear the government is simply waiting for them to die, and I hear that too often. It doesn't have to be this way. Extending and expanding the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act can give atomic veterans the gift of time, allowing them to focus on their health and their families rather than fighting a bureaucratic behemoth for their due. We owe them that much. Outstanding. Keith Kiefer, he was the cleanup veteran there and the national commander for the National Association of Atomic Veterans. Thanks for putting that out, Keith. We really appreciate it. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you. Have a great one. And remember, if we don't take care of each other, something went wrong.